The unwavering force of late-night television, Jimmy Kimmel, is credited with making Jimmy Kimmel Live a cultural icon and hosting the Academy Awards and American Music Awards on some of the most spectacular stages in the world, leading one of the longest-running programs in American television history. He rose from obscurity and endured the resentment of innumerable rejections to achieve heights few would ever dare to imagine. His humor and tenacity made him a living legend who is revered by people of all ages. He has influenced the cadence of television evenings for over 20 years, providing millions of families nationwide with solace, connection, and laughter. His name will live on in the annals of American culture forever. He is more than just a host. He is the voice that shaped a whole generation. His name is indelibly etched in the annals of contemporary entertainment, and he is a symbol of humor, tenacity, and unwavering dedication. However, beneath this shining legacy are eerie wounds that haunt his soul, the silent weight of illness, the innumerable losses too great to express, and the intense agony of fighting for the life of his frail son. For so many years, the world has only seen his smile, but few have sensed the silent truth that weighs heavily on his heart. Most recently, the storm rocked the foundation of the show he has dedicated 22 years of his life to. Join us as we navigate a life full of victories, but also marked by profound loss and turbulence. Before we get started, please hit like if you think Jimmy Kimmel is one of the most amazing talents in television history. He brought joy to the world while carrying pain that was unimaginable. It is devastating to acknowledge that the man who would eventually be the source of America's laughter started out in the precarious quiet of a typical Brooklyn apartment, rather than in a place of privilege. Born in the Mill Basin neighborhood on November 13, 1967, he was the oldest of 3 children in a heartbreaking Catholic family with Italian and German ancestry. While his mother, Joanne, quietly and devotedly cared for children, his father, James John Kimmel, had a steady job at IBM that were neither privileged nor impoverished. Dreams were modest, but survival was steady. Being the oldest meant that Jimmy was burdened from the beginning. He was expected to be strong and to look out for his younger siblings, even though he was barely able to defend himself. Being the oldest, I always felt I had to protect everyone, even when I couldn't protect myself. He would later admit with uncommon candor years later, long before the world knew his name, that silent responsibility became his first burden. That burden increased when the Kimmel family relocated from Brooklyn to Las Vegas in 1976, when he was only 9 years old. For Jimmy, it felt like he was losing the world he knew, but to others, it appeared to be a straightforward move. Overnight, the dry silence of Nevada's desert replaced the sounds of city streets, the comfort of old friends, and the laughter of Brooklyn sidewalks. He felt like an outsider looking through glass at a life that was no longer his in classrooms full of strangers. "I never really fit in anywhere," he later confessed with agonizing clarity. "I always had the impression that I was looking in from the outside." The boy's wound from being ripped from his world and left to fend for himself was exposed by that confession. Even schools, which used to be a haven for kids, started to disappear. Teachers perceived him as agitated and preoccupied. He was ignored by peers. He was there, but not seen, restless but not heard. Jimmy's first minor reprieve from silence came in 1983, when he started working at a student radio station at the age of 16. Despite his awkwardness and lack of polish, he found the faint spark of a voice he had never realized he had behind the microphone. Doubt, however, followed him even in that tenuous discovery. He pondered whether he would become marginalized again or if anyone would want to listen. Jimmy completed Ed W. Clark High School in 1985 at the age of 18. As his peers rejoiced over promising futures, he entered adulthood bearing a burden of uncertainty. After a year, he left the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where he had enrolled. He moved to Arizona State University in the hopes of getting another chance, where he stayed for 2 more years before departing once more. No safety net, no guidance, no diploma. Dropping out didn't feel like freedom, he would frank when reflecting on those years later. It was akin to failure. "I had no idea what I would become. I simply knew what I wasn't." Jimmy was at a painful crossroads by 1989, when he was 22. He carried only the scars of incomplete chapters. He had no degree and no obvious future. Every abandoned classroom felt more like a judgment that he was doomed to stay invisible, and forgotten before he even started, rather than an academic failure. He was embarrassed, burdened by doubtful nights, and terrified of disappearing completely. Nevertheless, Resilience was emerging from those voids of disappointment. The relocation from Brooklyn had strengthened their resilience. Persistence was etched by the pain of failure. He had learned to fight for recognition from the loneliness of invisibility. What appeared to be scars were actually the steel that would eventually make him indestructible. The boy who feared being forgotten was enduring pain in order to become unforgettable. But the world would not have known it at the time. Jimmy Kimmel's career began in the chilly, brittle silence of radio booths, which could be as cruel as rejection itself rather than with cheers. At the age of 23, he finally made his breakthrough in 1990 when he co-hosted the Me and Him show on Seattle's KQOK-FM. It seemed as though fate was opening its doors for a moment, but fate can be cruel. He was fired by the station within a few months. In the brutal world of radio, it appeared to the outside world to be just another reshuffle. It was destruction to Jimmy. He had already left college with the embarrassment of unfinished chapters and no degree. Now that his first professional opportunity had been snatched away, the humiliation was profound. That rejection hurt more than I ever imagined. He acknowledged years later, "I began to question whether I would ever return to the air." Jimmy was still full of obstinate hope and would not give up. In Palm Springs, he made another attempt, creating a modest show virtually from the ground up. He even extended an invitation to his childhood friend Carson Daly, who is still unknown to the public, to work as an intern with him in a desperate show of faith. Jimmy gave the project his all in the hopes that it would show he belonged. However, the show ended nearly as soon as it started. His witness was the deserted studio. The lull on the radio served as a harsh reminder of his failure. There were nights I sat alone in the booth after everyone had gone, staring at the microphone, wondering if anyone in the world would ever hear me again. He would later recall with painful candor. The ensuing years were a toil of fatigue and uncertainty. Jimmy took whatever radio jobs he could find, waking up at impossible hours and stumbling out of bed before dawn to get to studios that demanded everything and frequently paid little. Tormented by the idea that one more mistake would wipe him out, he lived in constant fear of being irrelevant. He once admitted, "I went to bed every night fearing that by morning I would be forgotten." He was scarred by the loneliness of thinking he might never succeed, and the deeper hunger of wanting to matter, not by hunger or homelessness. Jimmy refused to disappear following the Palm Springs collapse. No matter how small the station or how little the pay, he clung to any microphone that would have him in order to make ends meet. It kept him in the game, but it was a grind of humiliation and unyielding determination. Finally, a lifeline showed up in Los Angeles, a modest position at KROQ-FM, as the eccentric sports reporter on the hugely popular Kevin and Bean show, was offered to him through a business connection. It was not a glamorous affair. Stardom wasn't it, but it was salvation for Jimmy, who had spent years living in the shadow of failure. He was a part of something important for the first time. He went by the moniker Jimmy the Sports Guy for 5 years, which may have seemed insignificant to others, but to him it meant survival. He dragged himself into the studio every morning. Every self-deprecating punchline, every desperate laugh, and every early morning joke demonstrated that he had not been erased. The boy who had been silenced by rejection was gradually and painfully forming the voice that millions of people would eventually recognize, and this time, the world was beginning to pay attention. Jimmy Kimmel's early career was characterized by rejection, humiliation, and nights of silence that could have destroyed him rather than by wealth or ease. Rather, those wounds served as his basis. Resilience was carved by each firing. Every setback taught perseverance. He got ready for the stage in each lonely booth. Despite his stumbles, dismissals, and near erasure, he refused to disappear. Once afraid of being forgotten, the boy was already mastering the art of being remembered. Jimmy Kimmel at last found a tenuous foothold in a society that had so frequently ignored him through KROQ-FM. He dragged himself into the studio with heavy eyes and heavier doubts, enduring 5 years of waking up before dawn as Jimmy the Sports Guy on the Kevin and Bean show. Not because he was feeling victorious, but rather out of fear that silence would once again erase him. He delivered jokes and self-mockery every morning. It was not a glamorous time. They were years of loneliness, weariness, and monotony. However, he carved something invaluable inside that grind, a voice honed by exhaustion, a fortitude developed through shame, and a will that would not give up. He was going to go beyond radio with that voice, but the ascent would require even more of him. He made his television debut inconspicuously, working behind the scenes. Jimmy poured hours of unseen work into seconds of airtime by writing and performing humorous promos for Fox. Few saw it, but those who did saw the wit and timing that made him unique. He had his chance on Comedy Central's When Ben Stein's Money, which combined his clumsy, silly humor with Stein's sardonic intelligence. What appeared mismatched turned into something magnetic, and their joint Emmy win was more than just a prize. It was confirmation. Jimmy later acknowledged that he felt the weight of every night he had questioned himself, every morning he had stumbled half awake into a booth, and every humiliation he had endured to get here as he held the statue in his hands. However, victory did not make the darkness go away. Jimmy finally had his own stage and a platform to be fearless and uncensored by 1999, when he co-founded The Man Show with Adam Carolla. With equal parts controversy and laughter, the series was a huge hit. He also created Crank Yankers with Carolla, giving voice to places where he had previously been silent. However, beneath the ludicrous humor lay a man who was afraid of becoming a replica of himself. Every day I worried the jokes would dry up, that one morning I'd wake up empty with nothing new to give. He would later admit he became well known as a result of his success, but it also brought him a new prison, the pressure to always be creative, funnier, sharper, and better than the day before. As a result, Jimmy endured the agonizing pain of fatigue despite his triumph, knowing that every laugh he gave cost him sleepless nights and hours of uncertainty. When ABC gave him the opportunity of a lifetime in 2003, his own late-night show, Jimmy Kimmel lived that pressure only increased. For Jimmy, it was the realization of the dream he had muttered into vacant microphones years before. Now there were lights in his name, but they were hot. In reality, what appeared to be a laughing audience and a glamorous desk was a battleground of fatigue and anxiety. Hours of writing, revising, and rehearsing went into each 10-minute monologue. Scripts were destroyed, jokes were thrown out, and pacing was practiced until his voice broke. Every night of laughter was accompanied by an agonizing sense of dread, the worry that one mistake or poor review could ruin everything. People see 10 minutes on stage, he once admitted. The 10 hours of labor and the 10,000 uncertainties that go into it are what they failed to see. He was the one who made it appear easy to millions of people. He saw himself as a soldier battling exhaustion, anxiety, and the silent fear of failure. Milestones that appeared brilliant from the outside were brought about in the ensuing years. He made headlines in 2007 when he set a Guinness World Record by traveling back and forth between New York and Los Angeles for 5 days in a row. Although the accomplishment was praised, few were aware of the costs: restless flights, a body powered by fumes, and a mind pushed to its breaking point. His name was inscribed on the Boulevard of Legends when he was awarded a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 2013. Beneath the smile, however, was a man who understood that every star came at a price in hours taken away from relaxation, family, and tranquility. And he persisted. He was trusted by the Academy to host the Oscars in 2017, 2018, 2023, and 2024 on its biggest stage, even though he was the host of the American Music Awards for 5 years in a row. Every performance was both a victory and a challenge because of the pressure of a worldwide audience, and the awareness that every word, every pause, and every slip-up would be scrutinized by millions of eyes and headlines. But Jimmy Kimmel remained strong through every restless rehearsal, every sleepless night, and every moment he questioned his ability to bear. Jimmy Kimmel Live became a cultural institution because he refused to give in to fear or exhaustion, not because it was simple. Not only was every joke, interview, and well-chosen punchline humorous, but it was also the triumph of a man who once sat by himself in a quiet booth, afraid of being forgotten. More than just a career story, his journey from invisibility to immortality is a tale of how perseverance turns fear into legacy, how resilience turns exhaustion into triumph, and how one man's will to keep going became a beacon for millions who struggle, dream, and persevere. Jimmy Kimmel Live was more than just a late-night show for 22 years. It was the beating heart of his career, a living journal in which every tear and every joke was recorded for future generations to see. Knowing that millions were waiting, he entered the studio night after night, carrying with him not only his humor, but also his doubts, his weariness, and his devotion, because the show required not just moments, but a lifetime of surrender. He sat at that desk through missed birthdays, holidays, and family milestones exchanged for rehearsals. Every season represented a different chapter in his story. including the groundbreaking moments when a single sketch or interview lit up America, the emotional nights when he revealed his heart after tragedy, the joyful nights when laughter overcame even his worst fears, and the early nights when ratings faltered and he feared cancellation. On stage, he supported the country during times of crisis, publicly grieved when words were difficult, and triumphantly celebrated when happiness was scarce. Under the harsh light of the studio, it was a reflection of his own life. The show, which was made of writers' rooms with scrawled jokes, stagehands who became family, and a rhythm of restless nights that became unforgettable mornings, became his second home over the course of more than 20 years. The nervous knock on the green room door before air, the dog-eared joke pad that was passed from hand to hand, and the small toy figurine on the control desk that each producer touched for luck before the cameras rolled were all rituals that bound them together. Every seat in the audience, every outburst of laughter, and every awkward silence all contributed to his journey's mosaic. In retrospect, Jimmy once admitted, "There were mornings when the audience's laughter was the only thing that kept me going, and nights when I went home wondering if we'd survive another season." He once said, "This show has been my life with uncommon candor. I gave it everything I had, and in exchange, it gave me a family I never would have imagined and memories I will cherish until the day I die." The producers who carried the burden of every broadcast, the stagehands who worked behind the scenes but made the magic happen, the writers who scrawled jokes until dawn, and the young assistants who grew into seasoned veterans at his side, were all members of that real family. They battled deadlines in silence, laughed together in the control room, and celebrated every win as though it were their own. That studio was our home for 20 years, a veteran writer would later remember. We raised families together, grew old together, and relied on one another to get by. The crew members who had shared 22 years of storms and sunshine, who had carried Jimmy when he almost fell, and whom he carried in return, were as sacred to Jimmy as blood, because Jimmy Kimmel Live was more than just television. He sat at that desk through both public and private storms, through victories that made him feel strong and struggles that almost broke him. It was his lifeblood and evidence that the boy who had once been afraid of being forgotten had permanently etched his voice into the nighttime rhythm of America. That heartbeat faltered on September 17, 2025. The lights that had faithfully risen night after night abruptly went out after 22 years. In silence, the cameras that had captured every season of his life froze. An emptiness that reverberated louder than any applause had replaced the laughter that had once sustained him through fear and exhaustion. The delicate reality that not every word can be embraced in a world where every word is heard is what caused the show to be suspended, not a lack of talent or a loss of relevance. When compared to the fluctuating tides of public expectations, it served as a reminder of how brittle even the most robust platforms can be. A devastating reality accompanied that suspension. Even legendary people can wake up to discover that the house they created with their own hands is disappearing. This wasn't the quiet of a young man still trying to find his place in an empty booth. This was the quiet of losing a second family, a haven, a life rhythm that had grown as essential as breathing. It wasn't just professional pain. Hundreds of coworkers had been bonded to him like family for over 20 years, stagehands who had worked in the dark but illuminated the world, producers who had carried the invisible burden of every broadcast, and writers who had poured their hearts into jokes until dawn. All of them suddenly stood in a state of uncertainty. Camera operators who had learned every gesture he made, directors who had helped him navigate crises, and assistants who had become veterans. The ground beneath their feet shifted for each of them. For Jimmy, the suspension was more than just a program halt. It was the heartbreak of realizing that the people who had stood by him for 22 years, laughing, crying, and fighting, were now waiting in the dark for a light that he could not guarantee would come back. As if words could protect them from the silence he could not break. He was known to whisper apologies in private to his audience, his crew, and the stage that had given him life. The resurgence of a well-known fear, the fear of invisibility that had plagued him since childhood. The realization that the world might go on without him, and the possibility that the voice he had battled to protect would be silenced by fate, rather than failure, was what stung the most. It felt like losing not a show but a part of my soul, and watching a family scatter that I thought I'd never lose. He would later remark with subdued sadness, in those words, a man who felt He had let his family down both on and off-screen, expressed his unbearable guilt, in addition to his professional grief. Nevertheless, he managed to find compassion despite his grief. In a public statement, he expressed his deepest sympathies and urged everyone affected by the storm to be guided by kindness and understanding rather than using blame as the language of the moment. For him, preserving the humanity of those who had shared this journey with him was more important than defending himself. Nevertheless, resilience lingered even during this most difficult time. Jimmy was more aware than anyone that a career is evaluated by the impact on people's lives, as well as by continuous broadcasts. He was already ingrained in American evenings after 22 years of laughter. The evenings he had lifted the weary with wit, consoled the grieving with humor, and reminded millions that laughter is the one language that unites us all, could not be erased by one suspension. The legacy endures even if the stage is silent. The man who had once been afraid of being forgotten had already shown himself to be unique. This harsh silence served as a test rather than a conclusion. Jimmy Kimmel's story has never been about escaping storms. If his life has taught us anything, it has always been about persevering through them, helping others through them, and figuring out how to make even the most depressing silence into strength. Although losing his show was a huge heartbreak, Jimmy had experienced life snatching something valuable from him before. Losses that fame could never protect him from had already left scars in his personal life. Long before, the storms he encountered were not limited to the studio. Outside the lights, his private life played out like a parallel stage, complete with its own battles, heartbreaks, and love stories that could never be softened by applause. Jimmy married Gina Maddie, his college sweetheart, in 1988 before the celebrity and the glitz of late-night television. It was a union founded on the aspiration of two young people attempting to start a life together, not on fame. Their early years were not characterized by luxury, but rather by late-night strolls through peaceful streets, laughter over smoldering dinners in a small kitchen, and hushed hopes that the next day would be better. They patched together a future with more hope than certainty, sharing big dreams and mismatched furniture in their tiny apartments. They experienced the quiet rhythm of everyday life for 14 years, including early hardships, timely bill payments, and hesitant forays into the uncharted territory of show business. Then came the happiness that changed them both to kids who would grow up to be the mainstays of his life. When Catherine first arrived in 1991, her first cry filled their small house with a sweeter sound than any applause Jimmy would ever receive. In 1993, Kevin came along, and Jimmy would remember that as one of the few occasions when he felt fully whole, holding a baby in his arms and thinking, even for a moment, that life was ideal. Jimmy saw holding his kids as evidence that some struggles were more valuable than ratings or reviews. They were little hands that showed him why every sacrifice was significant and why love could feel like victory even in the midst of uncertainty. However, even during those early years, tiny cracks started to appear and grew larger with each late night and missed meal. He felt as though the very dream that had once promised a better life was now destroying the one he already had as the demands of his developing career drew him farther and farther away from home. Jimmy remained at the radio station, pursuing a future he could hardly afford to lose, while other fathers sat with storybooks at the edge of their kids' beds. There were times I felt like a stranger in my own house, slipping in after everyone was asleep, leaving before the sun came up, and watching my kids grow not in moments, but in photographs, he once candidly acknowledged. That guilt persisted. It followed him into the brightest rooms and settled like a shadow over the years. However, he wasn't the only one bearing the burden. Once a believer in the silent power of their love, Gina found herself all too frequently playing the roles of both mother and father. By holding the kids' hands at school functions, reading bedtime stories, and curing fevers while Jimmy's chair was empty, the dream they had created together occasionally seemed to her like a lovely but unfinished house, with a single wall missing. The cracks were less obvious to Catherine and Kevin, but they were still felt. The Christmas mornings, the birthday cakes, and the homes that never quite fit together taught them how to divide their happiness too early. The pain was steady, but not loud. The marriage had fallen apart by 2002. The silence of divorce papers ended what had started as a promise of forever in youth, leaving behind not only two children torn between two homes, but also a woman whose devotion had suddenly kept the family together. While her husband was consumed by the spotlight, Jimmy saw the signature on that document as more than just the dissolution of a marriage. It was an acknowledgement that love was insufficient to withstand ambition's unrelenting pull. That reality weighed on him like an unspoken sentence. He was the man who could make millions of people laugh, according to the world. To himself, he was a husband who questioned whether he had asked too much of the woman who used to stand next to him, and a father who frequently questioned whether his own kids had laughed enough around him. In retrospect, he would later admit, TV has never been the hardest part of my life. Knowing that I wasn't there for them when they were little is what it is. The wound of a father who, in his struggle to be heard by the world, occasionally failed to hear the voices closest to him is captured in that chilling admission, which fame could never heal. He never forgot the reverberations of his marriage to Gina. There was a hint of absence in every success. There is a hint of regret in every celebration. Perhaps the most important lesson was conveyed silently rather than verbally. Dreams require sacrifice, and some sacrifices leave scars on the people we love that cannot be removed by a stage, an award, or thunderous applause. Jimmy took comfort in the unexpected when the ashes of his divorce were still fresh. He met comedian Sarah Silverman in 2002. She shared his incisive wit and unafraid sense of humor. Together, they created something unique. A love story that began with laughter rather than luxury, with late-night phone conversations that lasted until dawn, with amusing notes left in dressing rooms, and with the simple solace of knowing that someone finally recognized the absurdity of living in the spotlight all the time. For 7 years, Sarah was more than just a companion. She was his lifeline, giving him hope that love could still mend a broken marriage. Their relationship differed from marriage in that it was more flexible, but also more brittle. They didn't have kids together, a house full of toys, or a chaotic home. But they had rituals that made their relationship sacred, whispered secret jokes during award shows, little presents in suit pockets, and the ease of leaving the stage to find her smiling waiting in the wings. It served as a healing chapter for Jimmy and a reminder that love can still find a rhythm in the lives of even the busiest people. Even though both of them were juggling careers that required all of their energy, Sarah saw it as a partnership full of devotion. But, like many love stories, theirs was short-lived due to the spotlight of celebrity. They declared their separation in 2009. The public saw it as just another breakup in Hollywood. For Jimmy, it was yet another silent tragedy, the death of a confidant, a person who had shared his laughter during his darkest moments, rather than a wife. The years he spent with Sarah were a time of joy for which I'll always be grateful. Even though it didn't last, he once thought, and when it was over, there were no custody disputes or court proceedings to determine who stayed and who went. The phone that no longer rang with her jokes at midnight. The empty chair backstage where she used to sit, waiting, smiling at his nervous fumbles. The echo of her absence in the places she once occupied. The heavy and unrelenting silence after laughter. All of these things were quieter and harder in many ways. Jimmy saw Sarah Silverman's departure as more than just the breakup of a romantic relationship. It served as yet another reminder that loneliness can persist long after the cheering has subsided. Even when love is accompanied by joy, Jimmy's life found a second dawn following years of heartbreaks and lessons shaped by loss. He got to know Molly McNerney, a writer on Jimmy Kimmel Live, in 2009. What started out as a quiet collaboration in the writer's room gradually developed into something more profound. It was not hurried or the result of spectacle, but rather of trust, humor, and patience. Jimmy was 45 years old when they stood together in 2013, a man who had experienced the bitterness of seeing love fall apart as well as the sweetness of love. He saw this marriage as a hard-won redemption rather than a young leap of faith, demonstrating that love can be stronger, more stable, and infinitely more valuable even when it arrives later. He found a haven with Molly that he had always desired but had never really experienced. She wasn't intimidated by the specters of his past or enchanted by his fame. She was an anchor who chose to share the burden with him. Despite being aware of the draining nature of his work, their shared laughter was the steady melody of two people who had survived hardships and now found serenity in one another's arms, rather than the apprehensive laughter of a brand new romance. Jimmy felt as though life had given him another chance at happiness, an opportunity to rewrite the tale of love with quiet mornings, shared routines, and a partner who was always there for him. Their happiness quickly expanded into a family. When their daughter Jane was born in July 2014, Jimmy, who had previously been tormented by his guilt over his first marriage's lack of fatherhood, held her in his arms with a deep-seated promise This time, he would be there. He wouldn't miss the occasions, the birthdays, or the brief, holy moments that become cherished memories. Images from those early years show him grinning as Jane's little fingers encircled his own. It was a straightforward but significant atonement for a man who had long feared that fatherhood would always be associated with regret. Next came April 21st, 2017. William Billy John Kimmel, their son, was born. The hospital room was filled with happiness for a few brief hours. The kind of happiness that gives you the impression that everything is back to normal. As if life had finally given him a perfect late blessing, 49-year-old Jimmy held his newborn son. But joy was ripped away almost as fast as it had appeared. Doctors found that Billy had tetralogy of Fallot with pulmonary atresia, a rare congenital heart defect from birth. The condition was so serious that it threatened to kill him before it had even started. Within days, their newborn was engaged in combat that most adults never encounter. His skin turned blue, and his breathing became shallow. Billy's delicate body was dwarfed by machines designed to keep him alive, with wires and tubes encircling him like a cruel cradle, and his tiny chest was opened before he had even learned to smile. Billy was rushed into open-heart surgery at the age of 3 days. After decades of bravely addressing millions of people, Jimmy's voice was stolen by fear, leaving him speechless. He fell into the hospital corridors and prayed for his son's delicate chest to rise and fall, not for ratings or applause. "It was the longest 3 hours of my life," he later admitted, sobbing on his show. "You have no idea what will occur. You would sacrifice everything, including your career, finances, and heart, to simply switch places while you wait." Notoriety meant nothing in that moment. There was no meaning in laughter. One small heart that was still learning to beat was all that mattered. Billy made it through the initial surgery. However, the nightmare continued. Additional procedures ensued, each one forcing Jimmy and Molly to repeatedly turn their baby over to doctors, despite knowing that pain would be waiting for him on the other side. They saw the scars that no child should have on their body. Nevertheless, they were forced to have faith that those scars would eventually allow him to survive. Under fluorescent lights, nights turned into mornings as Jimmy's face was deeply scarred by fatigue and Molly's strength served as the only constant. She protected Jane, who was only 3 years old at the time, from the most painful realities by standing watch in hospital rooms. "Is Billy coming home?" Jane would whisper. Jimmy would force a smile despite his broken heart, because sometimes the only thing a parent can offer is hope. Jimmy returned to television, shaky, and told Billy's story to the world. What viewers witnessed, however, was not a polished comedian, but rather a father in his most vulnerable state, pleading for sympathy for both his own child and all children in need. Millions of parents experienced the same heartbreak as he did, and millions of parents who did not have ill children were reminded of their precarious situation. That putting a healthy child to sleep at night is an immeasurable blessing. Those years taught Jimmy and Molly lessons that no prize could match. Instead of candlelit dinners and champagne toasts, their marriage was forged in hospital waiting rooms, in the agonizing silence between surgeon upgrades, and in hushed prayers next to beeping monitors. As evidenced by the way they held each other when nothing else could, their bond, which had been put to the test by fears that most couples will never experience, came out stronger. "The hardest thing I've ever faced wasn't losing a job or bombing on stage," Jimmy would later acknowledge. "It was witnessing my child battle for his life." That confession was a revelation, not just an agony. He might laugh at fame. He could be comforted by money. However, neither could protect him from the brittleness of love or the fear of losing it. Years later, Jimmy mutters to himself in a low voice, "Every birthday is a miracle." Each time Billy blows out his birthday candles, Billy is still going strong today, surprising not only his parents, but also the many strangers who followed his story. For Jimmy and Molly, every bedtime story, every dinner table giggle, and every typical morning is now sacred. Even though the scars are still there, they serve as reminders that love can lift even the weakest heart through the darkest night, and serve as evidence of survival. This continues to be the emotional apex of Jimmy's personal life arc, the point at which all of his regrets, fears, and victories came together. Once plagued by invisibility, he now understood that his life's worth was determined by how passionately he loved and fought for the hearts that beat closest to his own, not by how loudly the world laughed. No surgeon could remove the shadow that walked by Billy's side every day, even as Jimmy and Molly held on no hope for him. Jimmy has suffered from narcolepsy, a neurological condition that interferes with his ability to stay awake for years. He is known throughout the world as the man who keeps millions of people laughing until the wee hours of the morning. However, he carries the terrifying truth that sleep could take him at any time, without warning, in the quiet away from cameras. He has acknowledged that he once fell asleep while operating a small aircraft. These were encounters with death rather than humorous tales. Narcolepsy was a cruel paradox for a performer whose entire craft relies on timing, wit, and boundless energy. The comedian's body yearned to collapse, but the world demanded his endurance. Jimmy once thought, "It's weird to be known for staying up late when your own body wants to shut down at any time." Every unexpected surge of fatigue served as a silent reminder that, despite the fact that millions of people believed he was unbreakable, he was living each day on precarious ground. However, narcolepsy did not stop him. Every joke, every monologue, and every laugh evolved into defiance rather than just a performance. His triumphant presence on stage served as a nightly reminder that the spirit can persevere, even in the face of physical betrayal. Jimmy's perseverance served as a silent lighthouse for anyone who has ever battled an invisible illness, demonstrating that while hardship can mold you, it need not define you. But there were other trials besides illness. Jimmy experienced a loss in 2011 that went beyond physical pain. Millions of people just called him Uncle Frank, but Frank Potenza was more than just his real uncle. He was Jimmy Kimmel's warm, unpolished soul. Uncle Frank, a former police officer in New York City, gave the program a warmth and genuineness that no screenplay could match. His kind smile, his silly innocence, and his very presence served as a reminder to viewers that there was a real family behind the television's machinery. Not only did Jimmy's family grieve when Uncle Frank lost his fight with cancer, but the entire country of viewers who had taken him into their homes also did. The loss was devastating for Jimmy. Through tears, he muttered, "It wasn't just losing an uncle. A portion of our show's heartbeat was being lost." His tribute revealed on air that even the funniest men can break when love is ripped away, shattering the weight of comedy. Uncle Frank's abandoned chair was transformed into more than just a stage area. It turned into a symbol, a reminder that the studio was more than just a place of employment. It was a family, united by grief and laughter. It was the reverberation of all the backstage banter and private conversations that Jimmy and his team would never hear again. The audience discovered another reality. Nobody can be protected from the gradual pain of absence by fame, wealth, or a wall of cameras. Jimmy's story expanded beyond late-night television due to narcolepsy and Uncle Frank's death. It became a testament to perseverance to a man who, despite suffering and loss, managed to bring his shadows into the spotlight. At 56, Jimmy Kimmel is not only one of the most enduring voices in American television, but he has also come to value the commonplace, the very things he once feared losing. He lives between Hermosa Beach and Los Angeles, and occasionally he escapes to the peaceful haven of Idaho, where the South Fork Lodge provides him with the peace and quiet that years of studio lights could never provide. Once disregarded, his health is now protected by the discipline of a man who understands how fleeting life can be. Having narcolepsy has taught him to pay attention to his body. His energy balance is maintained by meticulous routines, frequent examinations, and the 5-2-2 intermittent fasting diet. His hair has turned silver. The soft lines of time are etched on his face. To those closest to him, however, these are not indications of his decline, but rather his survival marks, left by storms that did not shatter him. After years of heartache, his home life has become his fulcrum, a silent miracle. With Molly by his side, he is a husband who has discovered the true meaning of devotion, rather than just the comedian America sees on screen. Their son Billy, born in 2017, and daughter Jane, born in 2014, bring laughter and a constant reminder of why he battled so hard to survive into the house. His children from his first marriage, Catherine and Kevin, are still in his life, proving that love endures despite changes over time. Jimmy has made even the smallest rituals sacred, such as a shared dinner where everyone is at the same table at last, a bedtime story whispered in the dark with a voice that is soft not for millions, but for the child clinging to his sleeve, or a school run in the morning sun where the world becomes smaller than the voices of the children. In the backseat, they're not regular. They represent salvation. They are the silent triumphs of a man who, after living in fear of being absent, is now present in all that counts. He has been followed by material success, the silent outcome of decades of nonstop labor and sleepless nights. Jimmy Kimmel's estimated net worth of $50 million today is the result of his more than 2 decades as the head of late-night television, not chance. His real estate holdings in Hermosa Beach demonstrate his drive and sense of community. For more than $2.1 million, he bought a quaint house near the beach in 2004 where the sound of Hollywood could be drowned out by the sea breeze. 10 years later, in 2014, he added another property for $2.2 million, which he later gave to Molly's sister. This is evidence that Jimmy's family ties influenced even his business choices. He made his most audacious purchase in 2018 when he paid $8 million for a desirable lot in the same neighborhood with plans for a future home that might be close to 20,000 square feet in size. These houses are more than just possessions. They bear witness to a Brooklyn boy who, after a period of fearing invisibility, created spaces that were impossible to ignore. The story is just as striking in the Hollywood Hills. He paid $945.00 for a cottage-style home in 2002, held it for over 10 years, and sold it for almost $2.4 million in 2016. In 2018, however, the real gem was a $6 million mansion that was 5,500 square feet in size and featured a cabana, home theater, smart home systems, and a zero-edge pool. The view of Los Angeles below him from its windows serves as a daily reminder of his ascent and the hardships he has faced. His preference for cars reflects the same harmony between style and performance. The sleek VinFast VF8 displayed on his program represents his readiness to embrace the future of mobility, while a Mercedes-AMG S63 with its nearly 800 horsepower represents both refinement and raw power. Even though his entire garage is kept secret, these glimpses show a man who values both innovation and tradition. He has also been known to fly small planes, which is another paradox in a life where narcolepsy makes every flight both symbolic and daring, even though he has never paraded aircraft as trophies. Such occasions serve as markers rather than indulgences for Jimmy, serving as a reminder that the journey from Mill Basin to Hollywood is never measured in miles, but rather in the risks, sleepless nights, and sacrifices required to get there. The core of Jimmy Kimmel's story is not real estate, automobiles, investments, or even the occasional flight. They are the outward manifestations of perspiration, selflessness, and perseverance. They serve as monuments to perseverance rather than conceit, demonstrating that he has created not only wealth, but also permanence. Following decades of adversity, even though the studio lights have gone out, Jimmy Kimmel's life continues into innumerable other chapters. Outside of the late-night television stage, far from the desk where America used to see him every night, his voice has brought humor to shows like Road Trip, Robot Chicken, Garfield, and Family Guy. The Serious Goose, a children's book he wrote and illustrated himself, was published in 2019 as a reminder to the world that beneath the performer's suit still lived the boy who yearned to bring light into small spaces. He did this not for prestige, but rather for the sheer joy of making kids laugh. He saw solace in the outdoors in 2020 when he co-purchased Idaho's South Fork Lodge. It was a sanctuary rather than a trophy, where rivers flowed without cheers and quiet was not emptiness, but healing. And he joined forces with Fallon, Myers, Colbert, and Oliver during the writer's strike in 2023 to create Strike Force 5, a podcast that supports employees whose livelihoods depend on it rather than aiming for fame. It was Jimmy at his most vulnerable, not as a celebrity, but as a co-worker, remembering that there are innumerable unsung heroes behind every TV face who enable the laughter. What's perhaps most telling is that he has rarely sought publicity for his generosity. Jimmy personally donated $1 million to Children's Hospital Los Angeles and assisted in raising $1.3 million for Alex's Lemonade, a foundation for kids with cancer, following Billy's birth. For the St. Joseph Center Holiday Campaign in 2025, he and Molly covertly matched contributions up to $50,000. In addition, he has contributed to the following organizations: the Johnson Cancer Center, the Max Love Project, Jamie Oliver's Food Foundation for Children's Health, the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, Rihanna's Clara Lionel Foundation, the Los Angeles LGBT Center, the Friars Foundation for the Arts, and Next for Autism. These motions weren't staged for the cameras. They came from a deeper conviction that the scars left by suffering can be turned into lights. For those who are still in the dark, giving has never been charity to Jimmy. His method of transforming suffering into light to help others walk a little less fearfully has been survival. Not only is he an entertainer, but he is also a survivor, having survived the heartache of divorce, the loneliness of breakups, the fear of witnessing his son Billy's surgeries, the loss of Uncle Frank, the unrelenting burden of narcolepsy, and now the silence of a show that has been canceled for 22 years. He nevertheless brought something positive out of every storm: thankfulness in the face of loss, patience in the face of delay, and compassion in the face of suffering. His path is not one of a man unaffected by grief, but rather one who has been repeatedly transformed into a person with the capacity for greater compassion. Television has never been the hardest part of my life, Jimmy himself admitted at one point. It's realizing when you didn't give your loved ones enough of yourself. The real pulse of his legacy might be that one sentence. He had a stage thanks to his fame. He was comfortable with wealth, but what made him memorable was his love, family, and perseverance. Therefore, while his program's future is uncertain today, his soul's future is not. The lights of his home shine brighter than the studio ever did in Los Angeles, Hermosa Beach, and the quiet corners of Idaho. The kitchen is filled with Molly's warmth. Jane's giggles reverberate through the hall. Billy's laughter is brave despite his fear, and he makes quiet phone calls to Catherine and Kevin to remind him that even after a divorce, bonds can still be unbroken. Jimmy now plays his best role on these stages, not as a host, but as a father, a husband, and a man who has at last learned to value the everyday. And maybe this is the final picture worth keeping, a golden lamp glowing in his house. While the studio is dark, it was the soft sound of family laughter, not the thunderous cheers. Jimmy Kimmel's legacy is genuinely found here, not in the limelight, but in the hearts he touched. Please leave a like as a tribute if this story has ever moved you, if you have laughed with Jimmy, if his candor has moved you, or if you have just admired the fortitude of a father in a hospital hallway, in order to preserve not only the tale of a television legend, but also the tale of a man whose humanity shines brighter than any light Hollywood has ever cast. Share the memory that sticks with you the most.